I mean, we thought Liberation Day was chaotic with this cardboard picture of all the tariffs, but it's the same thing basically. And I haven't seen it, but I don't think we've worked out what the formula was to calculate these tariffs.
We've got the falling rates into the US East and West Coast, slightly falling rates into the Med. Then we get to Far East and North Europe, up 37% since the 1st of June. Why?
We can't make any prediction these days without saying something could go wrong, and it takes very little.
Welcome to the Freight Debate, the ultimate destination for supply chain professionals, logistics leaders, and anyone who's ever wondered what really keeps the world moving. Xeneta is transforming the way freight is bought and sold, so supply chains stay competitive, resilient, and one step ahead. That means we're not afraid to talk about the big issues facing the industry. And to help me do that is Xeneta Senior Shipping Analyst, as always, Emily Stausbøll. Hello.
Hello. We would struggle to talk about anything if we couldn't talk about the big topics here.
There's plenty to choose from. Well, you say that.
Yeah.
Well, I say that, should I say. There's plenty to choose from. And maybe there are, but this week's episode of the Freight Debate is, yet again, tariffs. Because we've had more tariff updates in the past few days. We kind of need, don't we? We kind of need some kind of klaxon that sounds now, don't we? Every time there's a tariff update. A kind of Big
I
Ben.
think my neighbours would start to complain if I did that every time I saw something.
Well, given the amount of tariff updates we have, they probably would complain. We'll tell you what, we'll leave 3 seconds silence now for a tariff sound effect if the producers have the budget. That sounded amazing. There we go. Right. The question that we're going to ask in this freight debate is: have we now gone through so many tariff ups, downs, U-turns, escalations, de-escalations? Have we become numb to the tariff shocks and desensitized maybe to the tariffs? Because, we'll cover what the latest update is, but it's fair to say that it still has a massive impact on businesses around the world, but it kind of hasn't taken up the bandwidth as it did when we had the Liberation Day tariffs, for example, where it dominated news cycles and front pages for days and weeks. So what do you think, Emily? Are we numb to tariffs?
So we're definitely not numb to tariffs, because even with this kind of 10% in place for imports from everywhere but China and 30% on China, if you're importing goods, that's painful. So in that sense, we're not numb to it. In the sense of keeping up with constantly changing policies, I think we've probably turned down the noise a little bit. If in the past we were okay, let's keep the radio on full blast and hear everything. At this stage, I think the vast majority of people who are involved in this are thinking, yeah, but does this get implemented? Of course, if it gets implemented, it's incredibly painful and we have to deal with it. But at this stage, am I going to spend the next 15 days trying to figure out how to deal with whatever tariff has been outlined in a letter? Or am I going to run on the assumption that actually they'll be deferred again or something else will change going forward? And that's where a little bit you get kind of that much more muted response to it than we got on Liberation Day, even though a lot of the tariffs being announced in these couple of days and weeks are in some cases higher than what we had back in April.
Yeah. Okay. So, we're going to talk about the impact of the tariffs because, a lot of shippers are now kind of in that period of time when they're thinking about 2026 budgets and such like. So we'll talk about what it means for shippers and how they can kind of navigate this situation. But before we get on to the detail, it's probably a good place to start just to give a bit of a recap of where we are tariffs wise. There's probably another sound effect. So rest of the world into the US, 10%. Now that should have ended, shouldn't it? last week, but now it's been extended to the 1st of August. The 30% tariffs on China is also going to run out in August. And what we've had in the past few days, just for information, we're recording this Tuesday, 15th July. So in the last few days, Trump has been sending out letters to various nations around the world with varying threats. He's threatened, I think, 30% on EU. It varies at 25% on Japan and Korea, Brazil 50%. So it's kind of more chaos, I suppose. But what's your kind of view of the immediate aftermath of these letters? Because it's almost like, we've talked about this. If you've got a naughty child, it's, this is your final warning before you're grounded. And then it's your final warning. And then it's your final warning. And I won't say this again. It's almost like he's kind of saying, I will give you 30% tariffs unless you do this. And it's, the deadlines are going back and back. So are we in a place now where people are thinking they're not going to come in? Is that why it feels like we're numb to it?
Yeah, I wonder if he thought that actually going into it 90 days would be enough to secure the trade deals he wanted, at least with the most important countries. I wonder if that's and that's just failed for however many reasons. But it is, I think, and it was also a testament to how painful these tariffs are for the American economy at the end of the day. If it wasn't a problem, you would just go through with it. So, I mean, we thought Liberation Day was chaotic with this cardboard picture of all the tariffs, but it's the same thing basically. And I haven't seen it, but I don't think we've worked out what the formula was to calculate these tariffs. It seems to be a little bit more kind of offhand, with Brazil suddenly getting 50% for political reasons and nothing to do with the trade deficit, because the US has a trade surplus with Brazil, just like it has with the UK. So if it really was about crushing kind of trade deficits, then tariffing the countries you have a surplus with is not the way to do that. But yeah, it's just more chaos on top of the uncertainty, and again, it's really, really hard to deal with as a shipper.
Yeah, and the financial markets haven't reacted in the same way in the past few days as they did following Liberation Day, when there was just it was catastrophic in the immediate aftermath, wasn't it? So it isn't just us that's saying, are we kind of maybe a little less kind of sensitive,
and maybe 1st of August, all these tariffs go into place. A week later, they're in place, and we think, okay, this is actually that's when they crash. But it's not happening on the news that some letter has been sent without it being official in any other sense of the word.
Yeah, and we've got the legal process going on in the background about the appeal against the fact that the sweeping tariffs were deemed unlawful. So that's also another thing that's playing out. So there's a lot of threads here. But that's the kind of the overall picture of tariffs. Let's kind of pull it back a little bit, because we want to deal with container shipping. The fact that this kind of lower tariff window has been extended to the start of August, again, is this another reason why we're numb to this? Does it really bring any benefit to shippers? Well, so is it kind of
what can you do in 20 days basically? Is that a window enough to get the goods you need, get them moving, all the rest of it? It's a very tight window. Maybe it's easier if you air freight stuff. We did have that back after Liberation Day, that kind of window of a couple of days where we saw increased use of air freight. But it's true, you've kind of, at this point, you've done what you needed to do. If you thought, okay, July 9, I've imported what I need to import, those 20 days, if you can rush stuff in and beat it, then go for it. But it's not like you just click your fingers and suddenly the goods appear and are ready to get into the US. It's a very, very short time frame in that sense.
Yeah. And presumably, we saw front loading of imports throughout 2024 on the start of 2025. We saw imports from certainly from China to the US kind of fall off the cliff in the immediate aftermath of Liberation Day. Then when the tariffs were lowered again, we saw the pedal go down a little bit, or a lot, on actually building up inventories. But recently we've kind of seen that ease regardless, have we not? That kind of front loading of imports. So even if the tariffs had not been extended, we're seeing a drop in demand regardless. So in that respect, does it again? Is it a bit of a? I don't want to trivialize this by saying so what, but so what?
No, and I think maybe just on your point there, China is the one country that's not really affected by this extension because its pause is still in place. So we're really looking at kind of imports from the rest of the world. But yeah, right. And even with China, the pause is still underway, but demand has fallen. There is not a rush of cargo anymore. There was immediately afterwards, but we're seeing it now. Falling cargo, carriers are removing capacity, rates are falling, and I'm sure we'll get back to that. But there's an element of, okay, how much more do we prepare for this hugely uncertain thing? And it's not free to front load. It has costs associated with it. So you're really going to have to balance those risks. And the outcome of that sort of calculation will depend on who you are as a shipper and your profile, all the rest of it. But no, we have not seen a huge pickup in demand immediately after this kind of next extension. And even if tariffs were to disappear, a lot of those goods are already where they need to be. You don't need to re-import that. You have it in your stores somewhere in the US, whether it's already through a warehouse, it's in a bonded warehouse, whatever. But it doesn't need to be moved again.
Well, even more importantly, the cost that even let's say Trump removes the tariffs now, businesses have still paid a huge amount to import the goods into those warehouses. So the cost, the inflationary pressure on those goods to the end consumer is kind of baked into those items, is it not?
It is, but it would add another. It is baked in, and there are higher costs. But to me, those are costs that a shipper would be willing to kind of absorb rather than pass them on. If you add tariffs, then that becomes a completely different calculation. But you have paid money for it, regardless of what happens. Those costs are there. That money's gone.
Yeah, but point being, the fact that there is this kind of upward pressure on the end consumer, the price that they pay for these goods, these inventories aren't going to decrease at a rapid rate like we saw during COVID-19. So it's just a lull. It's a lull, isn't it? I suppose. Yep. Right.
And it's the question of how long that lull lasts. Is it just through kind of this year and peak season and holiday seasons, or is it further on? And that obviously also depends on how high tariffs end up being. But we're definitely looking into a lull, and we're seeing that on rates already.
Yeah. Well, okay, rates. That's a nice segment.
If we practiced it.
It's almost like I assure listeners and viewers, we don't. I hope it doesn't come across that way, but we'll be honest. We know we don't really. You just know what you're talking about, Emily. Rates. So as we just discussed, demand falling. Also, is it falling, or is it just not kind of growing? It depends what your frame of reference is, I suppose.
And I mean, to be frank, the latest data we have on demand on actual containers exported is May. And May, we have the highest ever month for global container shipping demand, up at 16.3 million TEU. That's a record high. And that's driven by this front loading. But clearly, looking into June, July, we expect that to come down, as particularly as kind of the China pause that was really focused in May, that front loading we saw with a lot of new booking data, and that's really fallen off. So we would definitely expect June to be lower, and then July probably to just be even lower, setting the tone for kind of the rest of the year.
Yeah. So in terms of June onwards, 1st of June onwards, where we're talking about that fall in demand, we're seeing it in the rate developments. Far East to US East Coast, average spot rate down 34% since 1st of June. Far East to Mediterranean, Far East to US West Coast, down 57%, even higher. Far East to Med is down a much less extent, -6. And we'll come back to Far East and North Europe because there's a little bit of a story to tell there. But just looking primarily at those Far East to US front hauls, 34% and 57% drop since the 1st of June. I mean, that says it all, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. It says it all. It says we had an increase in May up to June that really peaked in June. And then carriers added an awful lot of capacity. A lot of that was used, but they over-egged it. And that's now we're seeing those consequences, rates coming right down. 60% in a month and a half is a big drop. It's also because we were up at quite a high level, so it's not because it's completely collapsed, but it is still a significant decrease.
Yeah.
And I think maybe it happened a little bit quicker than maybe we or I had expected, and that I thought maybe that push to import before the tariffs would last a little bit longer, and keep rates, maybe not push them higher, but keep them up a little bit longer than has turned out to be the case, because it really lasted for 20 days, and then rates started dropping. First of all, into the West Coast.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But business has been front loading prior to that, so inventories will have been up anyway. And I say even during the lull, or even during the immediate aftermath of Liberation Day, it wasn't as if there was a incredible consumer appetite to buy stuff that was kind of, so it's all, I'd say it's all just a bit downbeat, I suppose, in terms of demand and trade and such like. But yeah, and just on the difference there between US West Coast and US East Coast. So East Coast down 34%, West Coast down 57%. And you touched on it slightly there in terms of carriers rush capacity back primarily to the West Coast. And that's why we've seen the bigger drop there. And so it's unusual that we would see such a big. I'll take a look in a second what the spread is between those. The actual US dollar spread is between.
I looked just before we started. I did, yeah. And there's still a big spread. There's about $2,000 between them, which is about double what we would say is usual. So every now and then the spread does go up. It went up during the pandemic when people wanted the East Coast because the West Coast was clogged up. We saw an increase in that spread. And then, when we're seeing it now that shippers are getting cheaper rates into the US West Coast than they would be into the East Coast.
If we see that spread return to what would be more recognizable, whether it's $1,000, $1,200 per FEU between those two coasts, it's going to be because East Coast falls rather than West Coast rises.
Yes, in as far as we know at the moment, yes.
Yeah.
But I think I've learned that we don't make absolute statements these days because a lot can go wrong. But yes, that should be the way the spread narrows. But actually, speaking of the spread, we had the conversation internally a week or two ago when we were talking about the spread between the Far East and North Europe, and there we were saying because there was quite a big difference with the Mediterranean being more expensive, and we were clearly expecting that spread to come down. But we were talking about it as the Med would be coming down to North Europe levels. And yes, the Med has come down a little bit, but actually North Europe, the real change in the spread has been an increase in North Europe, which is an interesting development. So
hold that thought.
Sorry.
We'll come back to North Europe because I think it's worthy of a segment in its own right. But just to kind of finish on the rates, is it worth pointing out here that we're talking about, 57% drop into the West Coast, for example, in just over a month, which is huge. It is huge in the prism of ocean container shipping freight rates, but in the context of what businesses are being hit with in terms of costs through the tariffs, it's, they're not going to be popping the champagne corks, are they, through a 57% drop?
And rates are still higher than they were pre-Red Sea. It's not like it's collapsed to nothing. It's still higher than pre-Red Sea into the US certainly. So totally, it's better than it was a month ago, but it's still incurred costs.
Yeah. And just a very quick aside before we move on, Red Sea, more attacks on merchant ships. So that situation is not going to ease anytime soon, is it either? So North Europe, a nice little segue again. It's like we practice it, Emily. North Europe, we've got the falling rates into the US East and West Coast, slightly falling rates into the Med. Then we get to Far East and North Europe, up 37% since the 1st of June. Why?
Yeah, so North Europe is an interesting one because it's being driven not by demand and not by supply in container shipping. It's being driven by issues in the ports. And we're seeing increased congestion and also quite severely increased congestion in many places. And there's a bunch of reasons for that. We've had strikes, we've had some weather problems, we've had low water in the Rhine, which means barges get impacted. And then you just get kind of these delays building upon delays. If you're late by one day in one port, maybe you leave that port 2 days delayed, that then knocks onto the next port. And that all just kind of hurts the efficiency. And then you get these ports that are just filling up. So if suddenly you have to stack your containers, 1 or 2 containers more than you would before. Getting to that container at the bottom takes way longer because you have to move more containers. So it's all kind of building and adding, and every delay causes another delay later down the line, and that just kind of means the whole region is struggling a little bit with these congestion issues again. And let's not forget that sort of immediately after Liberation Day, before the tariffs on US imports from China were paused, there was a lot of capacity moved to the Trans-Pacific, or moved off the Trans-Pacific, right? They blanked a lot of sailings, and a lot of that capacity went into North Europe, and that's where we had record high capacity from the Far East to North Europe, leaving in early May, arriving then kind of late June, early July, and that's one of those starting points. That you had an awful lot of ships coming, not necessarily planned, they were added afterwards, and it just kind of builds from there when you then get strikes and weather and barge problems.
Yeah, but this is normal. This is, when we talk about the tariffs, that was a kind of, and even when we talk about Red Sea or we talk about COVID, these are kind of, not, I don't know if this is the right term or not, but they're not traditional shipping issues, if that makes sense. Not kind of, the traditional things that impact supply chains. What we're talking about here, labor issues, weather, port upgrades and maintenance, all that kind of stuff. That's just, that's shipping, isn't it? So, what I think maybe what we sometimes forget here is that when shippers are dealing, and carriers, to be fair, when they're dealing with the tariff issue, these procurement teams and supply chain professionals, they're also dealing with this raft of inverted commas normal stuff. So
I'm not sure I'd go as far as to call it just normal and this is what we always deal with. You might always deal with one of two of those things. It's rare that you get all of them kind of in one area at the same time. But yeah, it's kind of, this was built up by shipping. But even as saying that, kind of low water levels in the Rhine, that's not an everyday shipping thing. That's a problem with the weather, and that's changes. And we've seen it more recently a few times in the past couple of years, more than we have previously. So, I mean, to some extent, I agree with you, but maybe not all the way.
Yeah. Well, I'll say that you don't always. Yeah, I don't think you ever fully agree with me. So congestion in North Europe then. Are we looking at this being something that's in for the rest of the year? Because if you've got congestion, presumably it's not the easiest thing to resolve. It's not an overnight magic potion that you can, suddenly make it magically disappear.
No, and we Europeans like our holidays in the summer, and that also affects kind of ports and how many workers they have. So it's not something that disappears overnight. It also is quite dependent on demand. So yes, we have it now, but if you think back to the pandemic and the congestion on the US West Coast, how did that resolve? It was when demand was significantly lower and the ports were actually able to work through that backlog. So it depends a little bit on what you expect demand to do into Europe. And for the next 2-3 months, 4 months, maybe, as we have kind of those peak season volumes, that should still remain a problem because ports can't deal with the backlog. But once we get past kind of peak season volumes, it should then start to improve. But I think it could get worse from here. I definitely hope not. I don't think we're going to have kind of that huge influx of demand. A lot of that has already come. But it's going to take a while to work through the backlog on this one.
Yeah. And it'd be interesting to see how carriers try and get through this congestion because Gemini, if you maybe our listeners may have listened to our previous episode of the Freight Debate where we discussed Gemini at length and their kind of business case and offering for high levels of reliability. And we are seeing actually Gemini being operationally impacted, are we not, by this congestion?
Yeah, they've added some port calls in North Europe at those kind of smaller hubs that they had decided were only going to be called by feeders. I think we spent quite a lot of time last time on kind of why Gemini believed they could do better was they had relatively few port calls. So this kind of going back and adding them, I don't really fully understand why that logic then works now, but it wouldn't have worked in the past. But I guess we'll see. And we're kind of open to that and see how long it really lasts for, and whether they then return back or whether this is kind of a more permanent change. But it's definitely an interesting one to watch as this model, because you could say this model has now been tested by very hard hitting, whatever you want to call it, tariffs, and they kind of got through that with how they wanted to do it. This is then the next challenge, and we'll see if they can manage that.
Yeah, because this, as I was said at the start, this freight debate episode is primarily about the tariff latest update. But we need to cover the Norfolk congestion, port congestion, because it's just part of the overall picture, isn't it? That it isn't, the point about the tariffs is they don't just happen in isolation. They're another layer of chaos on the cake of
existing
of existing congestion and chaos. So in that respect, then, if we return to the tariffs and such like, and demand and rates and the relationship between those kind of metrics, are we getting here where kind of container shipping is actually a really good bellwether for global trade? And because we can see, we hear it on the news and we see the headlines of, and we're not going to get into the political debate here about whether the tariffs are good, bad, anything in between. But we're seeing, it's undeniable, isn't it, that we're seeing the impact of this. And actually, container shipping is a great way to actually see how this manifests. Is it not? Because we're seeing it.
It is, if you understand it enough. Because if you're just taking the really high level stuff and you're saying, okay, trade war tariffs, rates exploded. Rates increase when there's higher demand. So why, how does that fit with tariffs, lowering global trade? Why is there suddenly record high demand in May? If you can understand why and the dynamics between it, then yes. If you're just looking at purely demand and rates, you might end up a little bit confused. Because rates can then be impacted by the Red Sea and all sorts of other stuff. But obviously, container shipping is a very good bellwether for global trade, the health of kind of the global economy, and how much we're all trading with each other. But with a little bit of nuance, that actually there's some stuff that needs to be explained why we're not celebrating and cheering that global trade has reached a new peak because we had record high volumes in May. That is being pushed up by some different factors.
Yeah, and it's a good point, because I'm going to do a shameless plug here, but we as an Xeneta platform, our customers have access to the data, and whether it's transit times or long or short rates, whatever it may be. But what we do know is that during tariffs, and whether it's Red Sea as well, or whatever it may be, when we have these market shocks, is that they want to get involved in round tables, and Emily,
Yep.
You produce reports, customer only reports, where you add that nuance. And actually, it isn't just about the data at times like this, is it? It's
no, and like you say, it's round tables. You
Yeah.
don't necessarily want to speak to me. I can tell you in theory what's happening, but to get around and say, okay, these are all shippers in a similar position to me, to hear what's happening, that's hugely valuable at a time when everything's a little bit up in the air.
Yeah. Okay. So let's look at that then. If you're a shipper, this might be a nice way to round off this episode of the freight debate. Shippers will be kind of in the zone now where they're thinking 2026 budgets. Where on earth do they start? I mean, if you look at the development of rates in year to date, if you look at the development of rates year to date compared to 2024, I forgot what year we're 2024, then it's dramatically different again. So what if you're a shipper, what do you do? How do you budget for 2026? Is it because...
So let's just take a step back, because typically your shipper is budgeting looking at your long-term rates, and they haven't had that same volatility as the spot market. So to me, the starting point is really, okay, understand when did you last sign your contract and what has happened to long-term rates on that trade between that and today.
I know what you're saying, but even if you have a long-term contract, it's not like you're immune from the spot volatility. You still, let's say, I don't know, let's come up with something wild. Let's say, let's say Panama closes, another ship gets stuck or whatever, or there's a drought. Let's say Panama drought, right? And it closes completely. Even if you have a long-term contract, you're still going to get hit with surcharges, are you not? So you're still at the mercy.
But are you budgeting for that? Are you budgeting for that, or are you open to the fact that that's a possibility?
Exactly, but my point is you're budgeting now, and then, but yeah, I mean that's maybe an extreme example. But I mean your budget's still going to go out the window pretty much immediately, isn't it? Once this shock hits. But then, even if you think about just, let's not talk about a black swan event like another massive drought in the Panama. Let's just talk about just the actual freight rate developments, the volatility of freight rate developments over the last 4 or 5 years. That just demonstrates, that volatility demonstrates how difficult it is to budget.
And I would say to anybody budgeting, and we've learned our lessons from the end of 2023 when we were saying 2024 looks like a good year to be a shipper, and it turned out very differently, that we don't want to make that same mistake again. So we have to be open to that. It's different. But I think there are clear reasons why the spot market volatility hasn't been reflected in long-term rates at the moment. And that's kind of the starting point. Then long-term rates can rise and meet the spot market somewhere and close the spread that way, or vice versa, and long-term rates kind of stay where they are, the spot market comes down. And that's kind of where your starting point now is. If you sign rates 1st of January this year and you're looking to do it again in 2026, 1st of Jan rates, then you're kind of seeing, okay, where is the long-term market compared to where I budgeted? And what do I think is going to happen between now and January? Both what is happening on the spot market, if it gives me some indication of long-term rates. But if you look at kind of those big major front haul trades, long-term rates are lower than they were at the start of the year, a year ago even, which puts you on a footing that actually even long-term rates there's still room for them to rise in the next 6 months, 5.5 months, without going back up above last year's levels. But as you say, we can't make any prediction these days without saying something could go wrong, and it takes very little, because at the moment record high demand in May, North Europe, there's very little slack in the system. So whereas maybe in North Europe, normally in a traditional container shipping year, if we can talk about that anymore, North Europe would be a headache for anybody moving goods in and out of there, but it wouldn't have knock-on effects to the rest of the world. Whereas now, because there is so little slack in the system, anything would have a much bigger effect than you might otherwise expect. Not necessarily to the extent of kind of the pandemic, when congestion in the US West Coast just led to chaos everywhere else, but it's certainly something to consider.
And knowing your trades, and
your carriers.
Because if we take North Europe as an example, if we're saying that the port congestion is kind of going to be is going to be sticking around for the rest of this year, then presumably that's going to have more potential to put upward pressure on long-term rates compared to another tariff shock and a bit of a rushing front loading, which as we said a month ago or so when we saw that rush, that was temporary, wasn't it? That rush, that always pressure was temporary.
And even, I mean, we mentioned the spread between Far East to Med, Far East to North Europe falling. Maybe Med suddenly becomes more attractive. You import through there, move your goods in on sort of inland from there. That's also another option to consider. So it definitely has knockout effects on everything else, and it's definitely meant to be watched, even for those who aren't necessarily directly involved in the region.
Sure. And then finally, before we kind of wrap it up, again, a bit of a kind of plug here, but index-linked contracts. If you're in this phase of budgeting for, or attempting to budget for next year. Now, to be clear, an index-linked contract doesn't mean that you're going to necessarily spend less, but it gives you
or give you a guarantee of what you are going to spend.
Yes, but what it does do is it gives you some kind of understanding, and actually, if you're having to explain how your rates are going to develop and protect your supply chain so that your cargo gets where it needs to be, and you have a clear rationale behind this volatility. Again, you can see why shippers are doing it, and carriers are kind of
if you want that.
It's amazing, isn't it? We're in a position where naturally or logically you think carriers wouldn't want a shipper to have a.
They would. So they certainly would both want to.
Yeah.
But that is what we're seeing these days, because it's that uncertainty about getting your stuff shipped. So yeah, that's definitely an option, and we know many people have already gone into it, and many more are looking into it and trying to see how that works for their next year, for their tenders next year. Rather.
Yeah. Okay.
So
we've covered a lot
on that
of ground.
note,
Yeah. On that note, budgeting incredibly difficult. But if we kind of bring it back full circle to the tariff situation, we've got till 1st of August. Maybe have to have a special edition of the freight debate, or maybe not. Because
we'll be here anyway.
We'll be. Yeah, we'll be here anyway. We don't get out much, do we? So we'll be here anyway. Wonderful. Thank you, Emily. Really insightful.
Always interesting.
It certainly is. And thank you to everyone for joining us. If you enjoyed this episode of the Freight Debate, please hit subscribe, join the debate, and let's move the industry forward together. We'll see you on the next episode. And also in the meantime, please visit Xeneta.com, because if you're interested in index-linked contracts or anything else that we've discussed today, then you can find more information on the website. But until then, thanks, Emily.
Thanks, Phil.
Thank you. And thanks, everyone, for joining. Thanks.